The heat clung to the dirt like a second skin, cracked and cruel. Hollow Bend hadn't seen rain in weeks, and folks were meaner for it. At the edge of the main street, barefoot and dust-covered, stood a girl with a wooden sign. It read only $50. Her name was Willa, though no one had asked. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just stood there with eyes the color of dried moss and a stillness that made folks uncomfortable. Like she'd already survived the worst, and this was just another mile to walk. Men spat near her feet. Women whispered. One boy laughed, loud enough to wound. Levi Merrick had come to town for salt, nails, and nothing more. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 weeks, and he liked it that way. But when he saw her, didn't see her cry, didn't see her flinch, something old in him stirred. He walked straight through the gawkers, stopped beside her. 50? He asked the man beside her. You buying? Levi didn't answer, just looked at the girl, then said, not unkind, not warm either. You coming? She dropped the sign and followed. The ride out of Hollow Bend was long and dust-bitten. Willa didn't ask where they were going. Levi didn't say. She sat behind him on the saddle, her arms not touching his, her hands curled in her lap like she didn't expect to stay on the horse long anyway. She didn't cling. She didn't complain. She just was. Levi glanced back once, not to check on her, just to confirm she was still there. By the time they reached his land, the sun hung low and red over the hills. The ranch looked like something forgotten. Fence posts leaning like old men. The barn roof half sunk. The house weathered down to gray bones. He dismounted without a word and held out his hand. She stared at it a second too long, then took it. Her palm was rough, lighter than it should have been. She stepped onto his land like it belonged to neither of them. Water's out back. Firewood's near the shed, Levi said, his voice dry as the dirt. I'll make something to eat. Willa gave a single nod, then walked toward the pump. He watched her a moment, how she didn't look around, didn't marvel, didn't shrink, just accepted. Inside the house, Levi stood in his kitchen and stared at a cast iron skillet. He hadn't cooked for anyone since Mary died. Used to make real meals, beans with pork, cornbread on Sundays. Now it was just potatoes and silence. He fried them up anyway. She entered without knocking. Her hair was damp, dress clinging to her like the dust hadn't quite let go. She didn't speak, just sat on the chair nearest the wall and waited. He set the plate in front of her. She ate like someone used to hunger. No sound, no hesitation. But she didn't reach for more, didn't ask for seconds. He didn't either. When she was done, she folded her hands in her lap and waited again. Levi pointed toward the fireplace. Blanket's there. You can take the corner. She nodded, picked it up, curled into the space near the door, and wrapped herself tight. No complaints, no gratitude, no fear either. Just stillness. Levi sat in the rocker by the fire, watched the embers flicker low, watched the shape she made in the blanket, knees to chest, hair loose over her shoulder. She didn't make a sound, didn't even twitch. Not because she was unafraid, but because she'd learned to make herself invisible. He didn't speak to her, didn't ask, didn't need to. When the fire fell to coals, he whispered to no one, not even to himself. You're safe now. She didn't stir, but her breathing changed. The days that followed moved like thick syrup. Willa rose before dawn, boiled water, swept the porch without being told. She moved through the ranch like a ghost with chores, quiet, precise, unseen unless you looked. And Levi? He kept not looking, but he noticed things. The way she knotted his torn shirt and stitched it with threads so fine you'd think a seamstress passed through. How she left half a biscuit on his plate after supper without ever meeting his eyes. How she placed the water pail just so beside the door each evening, as if it had always been her habit. She asked for nothing. He gave her little. But when he carved a small wooden figure one evening, a horse no bigger than a matchbox, and left it by her water bucket, she didn't speak of it. But the next morning, there were 2 cups of coffee on the table instead of 1. They never mentioned the gesture, but that was the beginning of a language all their own. One evening, Levi caught her outside near the clothesline. Her fingers shook from cold, tying his shirts with little knots when the clips failed. Her hands were red, stiff, but she didn't ask for gloves. When he brought her a pair the next day, left them near the fire, she didn't thank him. But she wore them. That night, while tending to the lantern, she asked the first question between them. "You ever live alone before?" He paused, adjusting the wick. "Not always. Used to be a wife. A son." She nodded, not prying. "What happened?" "Fire, winter, wood stove cracked. Then after a beat, I was given away once." He turned to her. "Given? Not sold, not yet. First they gave me away. Then they charged someone for keeping me." Levi didn't ask more. Some truths came too jagged to handle on a clean evening. But she had spoken, and that meant something. He poured them each a cup of coffee. She drank hers black. That night she slept a little less curled. That night he looked out the window longer. On the fourth morning, as dawn peeled soft over the hills, Levi found her sitting on the porch, her hands still enfolded, watching the land like it might shift if she blinked. "You always this quiet?" he asked. She shrugged. "Noise never helped much." He nodded. "Fair." Then, almost too low to hear, "Do you want me to leave?" He looked at her long. "No," he said, and that was that. The air turned colder by the week, not with frost, yet, but with the kind of sharp edge that made animals restless and people guarded. The hills around Hollow Bend stayed quiet, but Levi knew better than to trust quiet. Stillness in the land often meant movement somewhere else. Willa moved through each day like clockwork. She swept the porch, patched shirts, boiled water, and baked hard, flat biscuits that cracked but never crumbled. She never asked what needed doing. She just did. Levi began leaving things out for her to find. His dullest knife beside a sharpening stone, a pile of firewood half cut, the tangled reins in need of mending. She fixed them all. He never asked. She never commented. One morning he found a clean shirt folded and set on his bed. His initials had been stitched along the hem in thread barely visible unless you squinted. That same afternoon he carved another little figure, this time a fox, and left it by her bucket without a word. The next morning there were 2 biscuits on his plate. No thank you, no eye contact, just rhythm. A kind of understanding was forming, not made of talk, but of action. One built on trust that didn't announce itself. That same week, Levi noticed hoof prints near the fence line. Too deep for a passing rider, too fresh to be old. He didn't mention it, but that night he loaded the Winchester. Willa noticed. She said nothing, but the way she folded the blanket on the rocker, placed the lantern closer to the window, and walked a bit slower that evening, it all said she understood. The next day, Levi checked the barn locks, then reinforced the hinges on the shed. He found the axe dull and ground it sharp. Willa brought in more water than usual. Neither spoke of the chill that had nothing to do with weather. That evening, as the fire cracked and popped, Levi sat in the rocker, carving. Willa was by the hearth, turning flour and salt into something that might resemble bread. She didn't hum, didn't speak, but the way her hands moved, confident, precise, he could tell she'd done this before. Maybe too often. "You ever live on land?" he asked. She didn't turn. "Back rooms, markets, sellers' homes." "What kind of cellar?" "The kind where you're told not to scream." Silence stretched thin. Levi's knife stopped mid-carve. "I don't ask for pity," she said after a while. "I only ask not to be looked at like I'm broken." "I don't think you are," he replied. She glanced over finally. "You don't think I'm much of anything." He met her eyes then. "I think you're here, and I think that matters." She nodded once, said nothing else. But when she set down the bread later, she placed it gently, like the table mattered. That night a coyote howled in the distance. Levi sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, watching the fence line. Willa joined him, wrapped in the patchwork quilt she never asked to use but always folded at dawn. "You expecting something?" she asked. "Not sure." She sat down beside him, just close enough for her shoulder to brush his arm. "If it's the past," she said, "I hope it knocks first." He let out something close to a laugh, dry, rusty, but real. "I doubt it will," she nodded. "Then we leave the lantern lit." They sat in silence after that, the kind that felt less like absence and more like space being held, a quiet that didn't ask for more. 2 days later, a rider appeared near the south ridge. He didn't approach the house, just lingered by the far cottonwood, half shadowed in the setting sun, watching. Levi stood by the barn, hands gritty with pitch, and saw the figure. By the time he reached the fence, the rider had turned and disappeared into the brush. Levi didn't chase him, but he walked the perimeter twice before sunset, checking gates, tightening ropes, securing hinges. Willa met him at the porch with a basin of water. She saw the sweat on his brow and the look in his eyes. She didn't ask what he saw, but she did speak. "You think it's someone from before?" "Could be. I don't want to run again." "You won't." She didn't argue, didn't offer details, just handed him the water. That night, he left the rifle leaning by the door and an extra blanket folded near her spot. And when she passed him his coffee the next morning, she did so with both hands. One afternoon, Levi came back from the field to find a loaf of cornbread cooling on the sill. It was lopsided, dense, and half burnt on one end. She watched him bite into it, waiting. He chewed, swallowed, didn't flinch. "It's terrible," she said plainly. He shrugged. "I've had worse." She smiled. Not wide, not long, but real. It lingered. Late that night, as wind rustled through brittle branches, Willa muttered something in her sleep. One word, "Don't." Levi didn't wake her, didn't press. He only looked at the coals glowing in the hearth and thought again of the rider, of the fence line, of the storm that might already be on its way. He wouldn't ask what "don't" meant. He never would. But he'd keep the fire lit all the same. It happened just after midday. The sky was too clear for comfort and the wind too still. Levi was tightening the latch on the barn's side door when Willa froze at the water pump. Her body didn't stiffen from fear, more like recognition. Her fingers clenched the pail so hard the rim bit into her palm. He followed her gaze toward the south fence. A rider, black coat, polished boots, horse too well groomed for work. He dismounted like he owned the land. Didn't knock, didn't call. Just walked forward, slow and deliberate, as if the dust itself bowed beneath him. "Mr. Levi," the man said, tipping his hat like this was a neighborly visit. "Fine stretch of land you've got here. Quiet." Levi didn't answer. He didn't move. But Willa did, just a half step back, barely more than a breath. The man's eyes flicked to her. "And Miss Willa, still breathing, I see. That's a surprise." Her voice came low and cold. "Decker," he smiled, all teeth. "Orrin Decker, at your service." He turned back to Levi. "Seems there's a bit of confusion over what's mine and what ain't." Levi wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward. "She's not yours." Orrin raised a brow, casual as a cat with a cornered bird. "Law might say otherwise." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and let it unfurl like a magician revealing the trick. "Signed contract, issued in Abilene. Bonded labor, $200. Until it's paid, she's mine." Willa stepped forward now, chin high despite the tremor in her shoulders. "I paid in bruises, in blood, in silence. That's worth more than your ink and lies." Orrin chuckled. "That ain't how debt works, sweetheart." "She's not going anywhere," Levi said, voice flat. Decker's smile thinned. "You think law rides with men like you?" "No," Levi replied, "but bullets tend to ride with me just fine." There was a pause, the kind that feels like the second before thunder. Then Decker nodded, slow. 3 days. I'll come back. With men, with law, with fire if I have to." He mounted his horse like the deal was already done. "Don't worry," he called back. "You'll wish you handed her over." Then he was gone, leaving nothing but hoof prints and a silence that felt heavier than before. Inside, Willa stood by the hearth, arms folded, firelight catching the edge of an old scar near her wrist. Levi poured 2 drinks, set one near her hand. She didn't touch it. "Should have known he'd come for me," she said. "He won't take you." She looked at him, then really looked. "You don't know men like him." "I don't need to." "You bought me too," she said, quiet but sharp. "What makes you any different?" He didn't flinch. "I didn't buy you. I bought you a breath, a space to stand. You could have walked past." "I know." He stepped closer, not touching her, not crowding, just close enough that she could feel the weight of what he wasn't saying. "I've buried more people than I care to count," he said. I won't be digging a grave with your name on it." Her lips trembled, but still, no tears, just that same steel under her skin. At first light the next day, the ranch came alive in ways it hadn't in years. Levi patched the fencing, reinforced the hinges, counted bullets, checked latches. Willa salted meat, filled jars, gathered tools. She moved like someone who'd decided not to break, even if the breaking tried again. "I won't hide," she said. "You won't have to." Before noon, a familiar shape rode up through the field trail. An old mule, a taller man atop it, one hand waving like he brought gossip and gold. "Toby Granger," Willa muttered. He grinned down from the saddle. "Heard your fence might be needing some company." "What do you know?" Levi asked. "I know Orrin Decker smells like ink and arrogance, and I brought something useful. 2 rifles, 1 bottle, and my sparkling charm." He dismounted and handed Willa the older rifle. "Shoots a little left, so aim just right." She took it, fingers steady. Toby nodded, then looked to Levi. "Ain't no preacher gonna stop him, so we might as well be the wall." They built makeshift barricades from barnwood and barbed wire. Nothing pretty, but it'd slow a man on horseback. That evening, Willa practiced reloading. Levi showed her how to check the sights. Toby told wild stories and exaggerated curses while sharpening blades no one had used in years. The wind picked up around dusk. It smelled like dry leaves and gunpowder dreams. That night, Levi couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the distant dark. Willa joined him, her shawl wrapped tight, barefoot as always. "I used to dream of being bought," she said. "Not for love, just for escape. Just for someone to say I was worth taking." She glanced sideways. "You didn't say it, but you showed it." Levi didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her hand found his, slow and deliberate. "Do you think we'll make it through tomorrow?" she asked. "I've made it through worse." "So have I." They sat like that until the lantern burned low. Not lovers, not yet, but no longer strangers either. The wind shifted that morning, not the kind that rustles through grass or cools the sweat on a brow. This wind carried silence ahead of it, dense, expectant, like the land itself was holding its breath. Willa was already awake when Levi stepped out. She stood near the barn, arms crossed, watching the southern ridge. She didn't turn when he approached. "He'll come before the 3rd day's end," she said. "He strikes before folks get too sure of themselves." Levi nodded. "We'll be ready." "I don't want to run," she said again. "You won't." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. He passed her a stack of boards and she began hammering shutters across the windows. Together they fortified the house. They turned overturned troughs into barricades and hauled sacks of feed against the lower porch rail. Toby showed up near midday, shirt half buttoned, chewing a stalk of grass like he wasn't walking into a fight. "You know," he said, tossing his saddlebag down, "some folks would call this suicide." "Only if we lose," Levi muttered. Toby chuckled. "Fair enough. Got 4 dozen rounds and a bottle of something mean. I'm in." Willa offered him a nod. "Glad to have you." That was enough. They trained in the yard, Willa learning to fire quick and reload quicker. Levi corrected her grip, showed her how to line the sights. Her first shot missed wide. Her second was close. Her third clipped the edge of the barrel they'd propped up as a target. By sundown, she hit dead center. "Fast learner," Toby said. Willa didn't smile, just loaded again. That night, they ate supper together around the table. Levi, Willa, and Toby, like a family cobbled together from worn-out pieces. The stew was thin, the bread dry, but no one complained. The conversation stayed light, scattered. Toby told a story about a rattlesnake in a preacher's boot. Levi half listened, his eyes drifting to the window, then back to the rifle leaning by the hearth. Willa sat quiet but alert, like the night was listening. Sometime after midnight, a branch snapped out near the fence line. Levi was up in a breath, rifle in hand, boots already on. Willa followed barefoot again, her coat thrown over her nightdress. They crept out together, Toby trailing behind with a lamp half covered by his hand. But it was only a mule deer, nosing the frost-crusted ground. Still, it left the air tighter. When they returned inside, Levi stood near the fire, rubbing the back of his neck. "You scared?" Willa asked. "Not of him." She stepped closer. Of what then? Of losing what I didn't know I still had. Willa tilted her head. You mean the ranch? He looked at her then, really looked. No. She said nothing, but her gaze softened. The following morning, they dug trenches behind the fence line, shallow enough for cover. Willa's hands blistered. Levi wrapped them without comment. You work like you've done this before, he said. I've fought before, just never for myself. You are now. That evening, the wind picked up again, dirt lashing at the windows, whistling through the eaves. Toby brought the chickens into the shed and double-checked the barn door. I don't trust the quiet, he muttered. Neither do we, Levi replied. Willa moved through the house with purpose, filling basins with water, laying out cloth, placing the loaded revolver under the pillow near the hearth. She touched the windows, the floorboards, the doorframe, not checking, just grounding herself, as if remembering each part of the home in case it didn't survive the night. The moon rose thin and cold. The ranch creaked with anticipation. Toby fell asleep with his boots still on, his rifle across his chest. Willa didn't sleep at all. She sat by the fire, knees drawn up, hands wrapped around a cup she didn't drink from. Levi sat opposite her. You ever believe in signs? She asked. No. I used to, she said. Then I stopped. Now I don't know what to believe. He let the silence sit before answering. Sometimes the only sign you need is the one you make. She looked at him, studying something in his face. Then this is my sign. He nodded. It's enough. As dawn peeled slow and pale across the hills, Levi stood on the porch and watched the horizon. His breath fogged the air. Willa joined him, rifle in hand, hair tied back. They didn't speak, just stared toward the south road, waiting, not hoping, just ready. At first there was only dust, a faint line rising on the horizon like breath from a sleeping beast. Then came the sound, dull hooves pounding hard earth in rhythm. 5 riders, 1 wagon. Willa stood behind the barricade beside the porch, jaw tight, rifle resting on her shoulder. Levi was up front, just past the gate, rifle at the ready. Toby waited by the barn, chewing a stick of jerky like it was a cigar, nerves hidden behind grinning teeth. They're early, Willa said. They're confident, Levi replied. Orrin Decker led the group, black coat snapping in the breeze, hat pulled low like a preacher come to deliver judgment. Behind him rode 4 men, faces hard, guns visible. The wagon creaked behind, covered in tarp. He pulled up just outside range, raised a hand like he was there for tea. You've had time to reconsider, he called out. I did, Levi answered. Still no. Orrin smiled wide. You got my girl, Levi, and I got the law. You got nothing, Levi said. Not even decency. The riders spread slightly, fanning out, testing the edges. Willa moved behind cover, exhaled slowly, and steadied her breath. Then the first shot cracked. Not Levi's, not Willa's. One of Decker's men, impatient, nervous, fired wide and high. Levi didn't hesitate. His return shot dropped the man clean from the saddle. Gunfire erupted. Wood splintered. Dust rose in violent swirls. Toby let out a yell and fired from behind the barn, his rifle barking louder than the wind. Willa fired once, missed, then adjusted. Her second shot hit a rider's shoulder, spinning him halfway before he dropped his gun and fled. Levi moved like a man who'd seen war. His shots were clean, controlled, steady. He took one in the arm, just to graze, but didn't falter. Willa ducked, reloaded, her fingers trembling. She whispered numbers under her breath. 1, 2, breathe, and fired again. Another rider fell back, blood blooming across his vest. Decker didn't advance. He circled once, firing toward the house, then turned his horse sharply. Toby shouted after him, Go on, run, you snake-spined coward! And just like that, it ended. The dust cleared slowly. 1 man dead. 2 wounded and carried off. Decker vanished back down the road, his threats trailing like smoke. Silence fell. Not peace, just silence. Willa collapsed to her knees, not from fear, but from release. Her hands trembled, dirt streaked her cheek. The rifle lay across her lap, still warm. Levi knelt beside her, placed his uninjured hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. She looked at him, eyes wide, lips parted, and for the first time the tears came. They weren't soft. They weren't quiet. They came in waves pulled from the deep, and she didn't stop them. Not this time. She cried like a woman who had survived too much without ever breaking, and now, finally, had space to fall apart. Levi didn't shush her, didn't turn away. He just stayed there beside her, holding on as the weight spilled out. That night they didn't sleep. The house smelled of gunpowder and sweat. One shutter hung by a single nail. A new crack split the porch rail. The fence was crushed in 3 places. One hen was gone, but the house still stood. They still stood. Toby took first watch, sat on the porch with his boots on the railing and a rifle across his knees like it was nothing but another Tuesday. Levi and Willa sat by the fire, the warmth casting soft orange across the floorboards. He poured her a drink. She didn't touch it. Instead, she said, "I didn't think I could do it." "You did. I didn't think you'd fight for me." "I didn't fight for you." She blinked, confused. "I fought beside you," he said, and her lip trembled again, but not from pain, from something else. Respect, maybe even trust. By morning, the wind had changed again. It carried the scent of burnt wood and broken pride. A note was left near the fence post, crudely nailed, a warning from Decker. "This ain't over." Levi burned it without ceremony. Willa watched the flames curl the words to black. "Good," she said. "I was hoping it was," Levi replied, "but I'm not surprised." They spent the rest of the day mending what could be fixed. Willa tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and shoveled debris from the yard like she'd been doing it her whole life. Levi wrapped his wound, refused to rest, hammered the fence until sweat soaked his shirt. Toby found a spot near the well and sat grinning. "You two fight well," he said. "We fight honest," Willa replied. He laughed. "That's the rarest kind." That night she made coffee, brought it to Levi in both hands. He took it slow, like it mattered. She sat beside him, shoulders brushing. Neither said much. But the quiet no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. The morning after the shootout was too quiet. Not the brittle, waiting kind of quiet, but something else. The kind that followed reckoning. The kind that left space for breath. The porch railing was cracked. A new hole gaped in the barn's side wall. One chicken hadn't returned, but the house still stood, and so did they. Levi sat on the porch steps, arm wrapped in a stained bandage, the rifle resting across his lap like a sleeping dog. His boots were still caked with dust, his brow furrowed from more than pain. Willa knelt beside him, pouring warm water into a chipped basin. She dabbed his wound with a cloth, gentle and slow. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He studied her hands, the same hands that once trembled while pinning laundry. Now steady, purposeful. They moved like they belonged to someone rooted, someone who'd chosen to stay. She wasn't the girl from the auction block anymore, and he wasn't just a man waiting for loss. "You flexed your fingers," she said, watching him wince. "Yeah, still works." "Good. You'll need them to finish that gate." He smirked, only slightly. "No more graves today?" She gave him a look. "Not if I can help it." By sundown, word had spread. Sheriff Henley sent a note with a farmhand. Said he'd heard what happened, that Orrin Decker's men had drawn first, that one of them had confessed in the saloon before bleeding out on a poker table. No charges, no bounty, no law left to twist. Just a quiet confirmation that Willa Ashford belonged to no one. That evening, Levi burned the contract. No speeches, no ceremony, just a match, a tin pail, and the way the flames curled the ink into black dust. Willa stood in the doorway, arms crossed. She didn't smile, she didn't sigh, but something in her posture changed, like a rusted gate finally closed. Over the next week, they repaired what they could. Willa mended curtains, repainted the porch rail with 2 coats, even though Levi insisted one would do. Toby stopped by with spare lumber and nosy questions. "House looks better than it did when Mary lived here," he said, eyes twinkling. Levi ignored him. Willa didn't. "She'd have hated me, wouldn't she?" she asked Levi later, in the barn, while he sanded down a fresh-cut piece of oak. He looked up, surprised. "Why would you say that?" "I'm not gentle, I'm not graceful." "She would have liked you for exactly that." Willa tilted her head. You sure? He hesitated, then nodded. She liked things real. So do I. She ran her hand along the smooth wood. What are you building? He didn't answer right away. A rocking chair. For you? For us? That night she stood in the doorway of his room, barefoot, still, calm. He looked up from his bed, startled, but only just. She stepped inside without asking, sat beside him. I'm not afraid anymore, she whispered. He turned, their eyes meeting in the dark. I was never your savior, he said. You opened a door, she replied. You didn't have to, but you did. She reached out, found his hand in the dark. Calluses met calluses. Neither flinched. Days passed. The rhythm returned. She baked bread, not perfect but edible. He carved a small shelf for her things because, as he said, her dresses deserved better than nails in the wall. She never said thank you. He never said welcome. But they knew. They didn't sleep in the same room. Not yet, but the hallway between them felt warmer now. Less like distance, more like time. One afternoon they rode into Hollow Bend together. It was the first time Willa had returned since the auction. She walked into the mercantile without flinching, chin lifted, eyes forward. Levi stood beside her, quiet but steady. People stared. Of course they did. But not with the same pity, not with the same cruelty. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mama, is that the girl from the story? The mother nodded. The child waved. Willa didn't wave back, but she didn't look away either. She simply stood there, a woman, whole. Later that night, back on the porch, she found Levi tightening a bolt on the new gate. I've been thinking, she said. He raised an eyebrow. Dangerous. She stepped closer. We should get married. He paused, the wrench still in his hand. You sure? No, she said plainly. But I'm not scared either. That's enough for me. There was no preacher, no ceremony, just 2 rings carved from old copper coins, a kiss beneath the cottonwood tree, and a shared plate of beans eaten straight from the pot. That night they laughed. Loud, full-throated, rib-aching laughter. And when the laughter faded and the house settled into quiet, Levi whispered the words he'd kept buried deep. You saved me, Willa. You just did it slower. She touched his face, soft and firm. That's how real things grow. Spring came. The garden took root. She sang while planting tomatoes. He carved toys in case they ever needed them. The wind still blew. The storm still came. But nothing inside the house broke anymore. Not her, not him, not the life they'd built from dust, fire, and a girl no one wanted, and a man who thought he was already done living. Some stories begin with a name. Others begin when someone finally says, you don't belong to anyone but yourself. If Willa's silence spoke to you, if Levi's quiet strength reminded you that some people protect not with words, but with presence, then maybe, just maybe, you felt something real tonight. Because not all rescues come on horseback. Sometimes they come from a hand extended, from a porch light left on, from someone who stays. What part of this story stayed with you? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Whether it's a dusty road like Hollow Bend or a quiet place you now call home, your voice matters here. If you believe second chances grow like gardens, slow, stubborn, and strong, tap the like button, share the story, and come back when the wind changes. Because some storms don't destroy, they rebuild. The first sign something was wrong wasn't the silence. It was Echo. The black stallion reared up with a scream that split the dusk in two, hooves pawing at the air, eyes wide with a fury only grief could know. No gunshots, no shouting, just the sound of one animal losing its mind in front of a barn door that wouldn't open. Inside, his master lay still. Jesse Marlowe had worked this land his whole life, honest hands, loud laugh, proud son. But tonight he lay on the packed dirt floor of his own barn, blood pooling under him, his hands still clutching the reins like he meant to hold on just a second longer. They called it an accident. The sheriff muttered something about rustlers, maybe a coyote spooking the horse, but the horse knew better. Echo never let anyone near him again, not the ranch hands, not the neighbors, not even Jesse's only son, Luke. Not until the day the man who pulled the trigger stepped foot on Marlow land again, and the horse, silent for months, screamed. The boots were still dusty when Luke Marlowe climbed off the porch and stood before the barn. Same boots he'd worn the day they buried his father. Same boots he'd worn since. He hadn't changed much else either. Not his coat, not his silence, not the way he looked at the land like it owed him something, and he hadn't figured out what yet. The barn was locked, though he wasn't sure why. Echo was inside, the only thing left of his father that had breath in it. He slipped the latch. The stallion stood in the far corner, head high, muscles tight, every tendon drawn like a bowstring. He didn't move, just watched. Luke didn't step forward. "Still won't come to me, huh?" Echo blew hard through his nostrils, a sound somewhere between defiance and grief. Luke took off his hat, ran a hand through hair that hadn't been cut in weeks. "You miss him?" The horse's ear twitched. "Me too." The funeral had been quiet. Jesse Marlowe didn't have many friends left. Not after the land dispute started. Not after he refused to sell the West Pasture to the Haverly family. They wanted to run more cattle, build a road, push fences where fences didn't belong. But Jesse said no. And around here, no had a cost. The sheriff called it bad luck. Maybe rustlers. Maybe Jesse had surprised them. No witnesses, no leads, just a dead man and a loose horse screaming under a pale sky. Luke hadn't cried. He couldn't. Not with the way Echo had looked at him, as if to say, "You're still here, so act like it." A week passed. Luke fixed fences, fed cattle, mended the gate that had been broken since spring. The ranch didn't stop just because the man who held it together was 6 feet under. Every morning he walked to the barn. Every morning Echo stood stiff, eyes wild. The others, stable hands, ranch neighbors, even the vet said the same thing. "He's too far gone. Shoot him. He's dangerous." But Luke knew better. Echo wasn't wild. He was waiting. Then came the first visit. Jed Haverly, big smile, too many teeth, hat too clean. He rode up the drive like he owned it. Luke was in the yard chopping wood. Jed tipped his hat. "Luke?" "Jed, terrible what happened to your pa." Luke kept chopping. "Sure was." Jed swung down from the saddle. "I hear you're holding the place together yourself. For now." "Well, now listen, I ain't here for nothing but neighborly checking in. But if you ever feel like selling, that West Pasture, maybe even the back creek." "No." Jed's smile twitched. "Just thinking of your future, son." Luke set the axe down slow. "My future's buried out back, and it didn't sell." Jed's smile vanished. He left 5 minutes later. Echo screamed from the barn after him. That night, Luke couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at a bottle of whiskey he hadn't opened since the funeral. A sound outside, software footsteps. He grabbed the rifle and stepped out onto the porch. Nothing. Then he looked toward the barn. Echo was thrashing again, not at random, at something. By morning, Luke knew 2 things. 1, Echo reacted violently only when certain people came near. 2nd, Jed Haverly was one of them. Coincidence? Luke didn't believe in coincidence anymore. The next week he started watching. Not the land, the people, the neighbors, the friends who didn't come to the funeral, the ranch hands who quit without notice. He started asking questions that made men uncomfortable. "What were you doing the night my father died? Did he owe anyone money? Did he ever mention something about water rights near the west fence?" Some answered, most didn't. But Echo answered every time, with his rage, with his silence, with his screams. One morning, Luke stood by the barn door, holding his father's old watch, the one Jesse always wore. It had stopped at 7:42. That's when the vet said Jesse probably died. Luke looked down at the watch, then up at Echo. The horse was watching him. Luke stepped forward, just 1 pace. Echo didn't move. Another pace. Echo lowered his head, barely. Luke reached out. For the first time, the stallion didn't pull back. He just stared. And in that moment, Luke knew. Echo had seen it happen, and Echo remembered. It was just after dawn when Luke found the print. A half boot, pressed deep into the soft soil near the west fence line. Fresh. Too fresh. The rain had stopped 2 days ago. No ranch hand had been out this way since. Luke crouched low, fingers brushing the edge of the mark. It was headed east, toward the creek, toward the land his father had refused to sell. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing. The Haverleys had always wanted that piece. Not for cattle, for water. It fed into 3 adjoining properties and had become a quiet war Jesse Marlowe refused to lose. And now Jesse was dead, and someone had come snooping. Again. Luke whistled low as he returned to the barn. Echo's ears twitched before he even opened the door. "You smell him, don't you?" Luke muttered. "Whoever he is." The black stallion stood tense in the corner, but he didn't rear this time. He didn't bolt. He waited. Luke took a slow step forward, holding out the same watch from before, his father's, like a peace offering. Echo stared. Then unexpectedly, he stepped forward. Not much, just enough to close the distance. Luke raised a hand, slow as dusk, and touched the horse's forehead. A storm lived under that hide, muscles rippling, veins tight. But Echo didn't flinch. Luke exhaled through his teeth. Good boy. He spent the rest of the morning with Echo, brushing him, feeding him, speaking soft into the dust. The horse didn't speak back, but he didn't turn away either. Progress. By afternoon, Luke was riding the perimeter, eyes peeled. Every broken fence rail, every snapped twig, every flattened tuft of grass told him more than the sheriff ever had. The law had given up. Luke hadn't. That evening, Jed Haverly returned, this time with his older brother, Clay. They came under the pretense of talking business. Luke met them halfway down the drive, rifle resting casual but loaded in his arms. "Evening," Clay said. "Evening," Luke replied. Jed offered a smile. "Didn't come to stir nothing. Just passing through." "You passed through last week." "Well," Clay said, tipping his hat, "we figured maybe things had settled." Luke's gaze didn't shift. "Depends what you mean by settled." Clay's tone cooled. "Son, there's no need for that." But then, behind Luke, from the barn, came a scream. Not human. Echo. The stallion shrieked like he'd seen the devil. The boards of the barn rattled. Luke didn't flinch, but the Haverly brothers did, especially Jed. He took a half step back. Luke saw it, saw the twitch in his fingers, the flicker in his eye. "You ever been in that barn, Jed?" Luke asked. Jed blinked. Why would I? "I think you have." Jed's jaw twitched. Luke stepped forward. "Echo thinks so too." Clay raised a hand. "Now hold on." Luke cut him off. "He never makes a sound unless Jed's near. You notice that?" Clay frowned. "He's just a damn horse." "He's the only witness I've got." They left quickly. This time, Luke didn't watch them go. Echo did. Later that night, Luke sat on the porch with Clara. She hadn't said much since Jesse's funeral. His death had left a silence between them neither knew how to name. But tonight she broke it. "I don't like those men." "Me neither." "You think they did it?" Luke nodded. Clara stared at the darkened horizon. "What are you going to do?" Luke turned the pocket watch in his hand. "Whatever it takes." He began the next day with a plan. Echo was the key. If the horse only reacted to those involved in the murder, maybe he could help narrow the field. So Luke began testing it. He invited 3 former ranch hands to visit. Each had worked the land. One had even helped dig Jesse's grave. The first man entered the barn. Echo shifted, but nothing more. The second was met with a whinny of curiosity. Not anger. Recognition, maybe. The third, Tom Pritchard, barely stepped through the door before Echo bucked so hard he nearly broke the stall gate. Luke lunged forward, grabbing the reins just in time. Pritchard stumbled back, cursing. "What the hell's wrong with that horse?" Luke didn't answer. Because he knew. It wasn't what was wrong. It was who. That night, Luke paid a visit to the local land records office. It was nothing more than a dusty room in the back of the town hall, but it held answers. He searched the files under Marlowe and Haverly. It didn't take long. 2 weeks before Jesse's death, a proposed expansion permit had been filed by Clay Haverly. It overlapped Jesse's West Creek pasture, but the application had been denied because Jesse had refused to sign. Luke's stomach turned. He followed the paper trail deeper, fingers flipping faster now. Buried in the back of the file was a second permit. This one, approved. 2 days after Jesse's death. Signed by Jed Haverly, on behalf of family interests. The signature line where Jesse's name should have been? Forged. Luke stood still in the dark of that records room, hands trembling. They hadn't just killed his father. They'd stolen what he died protecting. The next morning, Luke didn't ride to the fence. He rode to the sheriff. He laid the documents on the desk. Then he laid down a small cloth pouch. Inside was his father's watch, covered in blood, discovered in the creek bed behind the barn. Right where Pritchard had claimed he never set foot. By sundown, Clay Haverly was in cuffs. Jed had vanished. And Tom Pritchard? He was found packing a saddlebag with gold he couldn't explain. Justice moved slow in the West. But not today. Not with Echo watching. That night, Luke stood in the barn. He didn't speak. Echo didn't move. But when Luke held out his hand, Echo stepped forward and lowered his head into Luke's palm. Not as a beast, not as a burden, but as something closer to a brother. They said Jed Haverly crossed the county line before noon. They said he took the South Trail, spurred his horse till it bled, and disappeared into the salt flats like a ghost with no name. But Luke didn't believe it. Not because Jed wasn't a coward, but because he knew Jed Haverly didn't run far from what he thought he still owned. The next 3 days, Luke barely slept. With Clay behind bars and Tom Pritchard singing like a bird to save his own hide, pieces of the truth had finally fallen into place. Jesse Marlowe had refused to sign over the creek pasture. Jed had forged the documents. Clay had provided the muscle. Tom had lured Jesse to the barn under false pretenses. And when Jesse said no again, it wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution. But Jed pulled the trigger, and he was still out there. Luke packed light, a bedroll, a flask, his father's rifle, an Echo. The stallion didn't need reins anymore. He moved with Luke like they shared a spine. Clara watched them from the porch as they left. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. Luke shook his head. "I do." Clara nodded. But before he turned to go, she stepped forward and placed something in his saddlebag. A folded paper. "Open it when you need to remember why you're coming home." The trail south was dry, the wind sharp. Luke followed whispers more than tracks. An old man at the trading post said he saw Jed buy whiskey. A young girl near the crossing said a man with 2 clean boots scared her pa. Each clue pointed in the same direction, back to a burned-out shack in the canyons, a place once owned by the Haverleys before their money turned cold. Echo grew restless as they approached. Not afraid, just alert. By dusk, Luke saw it. Smoke. Not much. Just enough to mean fire, and fire meant someone stayed the night. He dismounted a ridge away and approached on foot. The shack's windows were boarded, but the door hung crooked. He circled wide, found hoof prints. Fresh. He crouched, still warm. Inside, he could hear someone moving. Boots. Shuffling. Breath. Jedna. Luke stepped into the doorway with his rifle half raised. Luke's voice cut through the dust. "I'm not here for justice. I'm here to end what you started." Jed flinched. "Luke," he breathed like he was surprised to see a ghost. "I could say the same," Luke replied. Jed lowered the pistol slightly. "You come to kill me?" "No," Luke said. "That's the difference between us." Jed laughed, dry and broken. "You think you're better?" "I think my father deserved better than the dirt you buried him in." Jed's voice cracked. "He was going to ruin us." "Number, he just wouldn't play your game." Jed stepped back. "It was Clay's idea." Luke didn't move. "And who pulled the trigger?" Jed's eyes flickered. That was enough. Luke stepped forward and stripped the pistol from his hand. Jed didn't fight it, didn't speak. He just slumped to the floor and muttered something that didn't matter anymore. He brought Jed back tied to Echo's lead. The ride home took 2 days. The stallion never bucked, never flinched. He just moved like the land itself wanted justice. When they returned to the ranch, Clara met them at the gate. She didn't ask what happened. She just took Luke's hand and squeezed. That night, Luke opened the folded paper in his saddlebag. It was a drawing, a child's sketch, a man, a woman, a black horse, and a boy holding a star-shaped flower. At the bottom, Clara had written, "When you come home, let's name him Jesse." Luke smiled for the first time in months. Echo nudged his shoulder. The barn had been silent for 3 days. Not the tense kind of silence Echo used to keep, the one that crackled with grief and defiance. This was different. This was stillness, like the land itself had finally taken a breath. Jed Haverly had been delivered to the county marshal. Clay remained in jail, awaiting trial. Pritchard had fled town altogether, but no one missed him. And the black stallion that had once thrashed and screamed inside these walls now stood calm, watching Luke with dark, knowing eyes. Luke came early that morning, before the sun crested the ridge. Clara was still asleep, curled in the big bed they had moved into the main house. The spare bedroom had sat unused for too long. That was the past. This was something else. He brought a bucket of oats, 2 apples, and Jesse's old brush. The leather handle was worn, the bristles soft with time. Luke used to think it looked pointless. Now he understood. It wasn't for cleaning, it was for trust. Echo didn't move when he opened the stall, didn't pin his ears or stamp his feet. Luke stepped inside without flinching. "You remember this, don't you?" he said, lifting the brush. The horse blinked slow. Luke ran it along Echo's neck, down his flank, over the ribs that had once shuddered with rage. Now there was only breath, deep, slow, steady. "You're still here," Luke whispered. Echo snorted. "So am I." Outside, the land shimmered in the dawn. The fences were still broken in places, but the gates held. The cattle had returned to the lower pasture, and the water from the West Creek, his creek, flowed unbothered again. A new foreman had come on 2 days ago, old friend of Jesse's. Quiet man, good hands, didn't ask questions. Luke liked that. He didn't need talk. He needed action, and he needed time. Clara came to the barn mid-morning. She wore her riding skirt, boots already dusted from the walk, a cup of coffee in one hand and Luke's hat in the other. "You left this," she said. Luke took it from her without a word. Clara stepped inside and leaned on the stall rail, sipping slowly. Echo's eyes shifted toward her, calm. "He's beautiful when he's not trying to kill someone," she murmured. Luke chuckled. "You should have seen my father on a bad day." "I did. Once." "Oh?" "He offered to teach me how to shoot. I told him I was a pacifist." "What did he say?" "He laughed, said good. Just means you'll aim to stop, not to kill." Then handed me the gun anyway. Luke smiled. "Sounds like him." They didn't speak for a while. Outside, the sun climbed. Echo grazed lazily in his stall. Clara sipped her coffee in silence, then reached across the stall rail. Her fingers brushed Luke's sleeve. "He's watching you, you know." Luke glanced at Echo, then back at her. "Maybe I'm watching him too." She smiled, soft and sad. "You both came back different." "Not different," Luke said. "Just, ready." Finally, Clara said, "Do you think it's really over?" Luke set the brush down and leaned against the post. "I think we bought enough peace to start something." "Something like what?" Luke glanced at her hand. She still wore the ring. "I was thinking maybe we build that corral you always talked about." Clara smiled. "You mean the one for kids or the one for colts?" He paused. "Maybe both." She reached out and took his hand, and for the first time since Jesse's death, the barn didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a beginning. That afternoon, they rode the property together, Luke on Echo, Clara on her gentle bay mare. Echo was steady now, no bucking, no jerking. He responded to Luke's hands like they were extensions of each other. They passed the west pasture, newly fenced. They passed the marker where Jesse was buried, simple stone, carved name, no epitaph. Luke dismounted, stood quietly by the grave. Clara joined him. "He'd be proud of you," she said. Luke shook his head. "He didn't want me to become like him." "You didn't. You became someone he could trust when he was gone." Echo stepped forward and touched his muzzle to the grave. Clara gasped softly. Luke swallowed a lump in his throat. "Goodbye, Pa." The next month passed in a rhythm the ranch hadn't known in years. They planted new grass near the South Trail. Luke hired back 2 old hands. Clara reopened the small vegetable garden behind the house, and Echo, once a menace to anyone within reach, became the heart of the land. He still didn't trust everyone, but he trusted Luke, and when Clara came to feed him, he let her stroke his mane. Sometimes when Luke worked late fixing fence posts or hauling feed, Echo would stand just outside the barn, watching like a sentinel. It didn't go unnoticed. They started calling him the ghost of Jesse's barn. He didn't spook, didn't run, didn't stray. He just stayed. Clara woke one morning with her hand on her belly. Luke stirred beside her. "You all right?" She nodded, lips curved in a smile. "I think we're going to need that second corral sooner than we thought." Luke sat up. "You sure?" "I'm sure." He kissed her forehead, then her hand. Outside, Echo whinnied, short, sharp, like he knew. Luke laughed. "Guess you're getting a rider of your own soon." They named the boy Jesse. He had his mother's smile and his grandfather's stubborn eyes. On his first birthday, Luke brought him to the barn, set him on the edge of Echo's stall. The black stallion stepped forward, ears alert. Clara held her breath. The baby reached out, tiny fingers, soft as cotton, and touched Echo's nose. The horse leaned in, closed his eyes, exhaled, and just like that, Echo, who had once refused even Luke's touch, lowered his head in surrender. Only the boy, no one else. That day, Luke carved a new sign for the barn. Echo's End. It wasn't about death. It was about what came after. The letter arrived in the fall. Thick envelope, wax seal, no return address. Clara found it first, tucked between feed bills and a catalog for winter coats. She turned it over twice before handing it to Luke, her brow already furrowed. Luke took one look and stiffened. The seal wasn't official, not from the county nor the bank. But the color, the same dark red Jesse used to mark his personal things, was unmistakable. He opened it with a knife and pulled out a single sheet of thick paper, yellowed at the edges. It wasn't dated, but the handwriting? Luke would have recognized it anywhere. His father's. "If you're reading this, son, then I'm gone. Don't waste time on vengeance. I know that's hard to hear, but listen anyway. I didn't raise you to carry hate. I raised you to build something better. This land, it's yours now, but it ain't about fences or deeds. It's about who rides it and what they believe in. If you protect it with love, it'll never be taken from you. If you protect the people on it, you'll never ride alone. And if Echo lets Jesse ride him one day, then I'll know you made it." Luke didn't speak after reading it. Didn't need to. He just sat on the porch. Letter folded in his hand, eyes on the distant barn. Clara sat beside him, silent. Sometimes the past doesn't need words, just the sound of breath, of wind, of knowing. That winter things changed, not suddenly, but with purpose. Luke built the corral Clara had once sketched in the margins of her notebook, wide, sturdy, with split-rail fences and a training ring in the center. It was meant for colts, for children, for futures not yet written. Echo stood by the gate each morning, watching, not pacing, not snorting, watching. By spring, the ranch had 5 new foals and 3 new ranch hands. Word had spread. The Marlows were building again, and the town responded. Old enemies didn't return, but old friends did. A preacher came by with a request to host a community gathering on the property. Luke hesitated at first. He'd never been a man of crowds. But Clara said yes before he could say no. "It's not about us," she said. "It's about letting people know this land means something again." Luke nodded. And when the townsfolk came, over 40 of them, they didn't come with hands out. They came with hammers, nails, pies, and songs. And Luke realized something. This wasn't just his father's land. It was everyone's memory and everyone's hope. Echo walked among them that day. No saddle, no rope, just his presence. And when the children reached out, he let them. But only one, little Jesse, got close enough to touch his mane. Luke kept the letter in his shirt pocket after that. Not always for reading, just to feel it against his chest, like a second heartbeat. And when things got hard, and they still did now and then, he'd find a quiet place by the creek and unfold it again. Especially the last line. If Echo lets Jesse ride him one day, that thought stayed with him, not as a goal, but as a promise. Years passed in seasons. Fences wore down and were rebuilt. Trees grew tall, then snapped in storms. And Jesse grew, bright-eyed, curious, as stubborn as his grandfather, and twice as clever. He didn't cry when he fell off his first pony, didn't whine when Echo ignored him for months, just kept showing up at the barn, same hour, same apple, same quiet voice. And one morning, on his 5th birthday, he walked into the barn and Echo stepped forward without a sound. No protest, no noise. He bowed his head, and Jesse swung up onto his back like he'd been doing it forever. Luke saw it from the house. Clara gasped. Luke dropped the hammer in his hand and sprinted. By the time he reached the gate, Jesse was riding in slow circles. Echo's steps were careful, measured, like he knew this was sacred. Clara clutched Luke's arm. "You seeing this?" "I see it." "What does it mean?" Luke pulled the folded letter from his pocket. "Means we made it." That night, they had a fire out under the stars. Jesse curled up in Clara's arms, already half asleep from the excitement. Echo stood nearby, untied, nibbling grass with the serenity of a horse who had nothing left to prove. Luke sat back in his chair, boots propped on a stump, eyes on the sky. He thought of Jesse, the old one, and the new. He thought of blood spilled in barns, and letters that reached beyond the grave, and of how a broken animal had stitched an entire family back together. Echo whinnied softly. Luke raised his glass. "To legacy," Clara leaned in. "To peace," and little Jesse murmured something in his sleep. Something about riding fast and never falling. Luke smiled. The wind picked up, but the fire held strong. The spring Jesse turned 10, the rains came late. The field stayed dry, and the well by the north pasture whispered empty by June. But no one complained. Not Clara, not Luke, not the men who worked the fences barefoot to save their boots for town Sundays. This was the price of land. It gave when it could, and when it didn't, you gave back. Jesse didn't notice the dry season. He was too busy riding Echo. Every morning before breakfast, every evening before the sky turned purple, he'd be out there, bareback, wind in his hair, laughing like nothing bad ever lived on this earth. Luke didn't stop him, not once, because every time he watched Jesse ride that stallion, it felt like watching something holy. Echo had grown slower over the years. His gait wasn't what it once was, but his eyes were still sharp, still focused, still proud. Some said he should be retired. Some said put him to pasture. But Luke knew better. Echo would tell them when it was time. That time came in August. It started with a stumble. Subtle. Easy to miss. Jesse came riding in from the back ridge one afternoon, face flushed, shirt damp with sweat, and said, "He tripped, Pa." Just once, but I felt it. Luke checked the stallion's hooves. Nothing. But he saw it in Echo's eyes. Something was dimming. They slowed the rides after that. Jesse understood. Clara made a fuss about feeding Echo softer oats. Luke added fresh straw to the stall twice a week. The stallion never complained. But he started walking more than running, resting more than moving. And every night he would turn his head toward the horizon and watch the sun disappear, like he was remembering something, or someone. The last ride happened on a Tuesday. Cloudless sky, no wind, the kind of still that felt like it had been planned. Jesse saddled Echo gently, didn't even ask permission this time. Luke stood by the barn door. Clara watched from the porch. They didn't speak. They just knew. Jesse took the stallion to the top of the hill by the old windmill, rode him once around the ridge, then let him stop. And Echo stood there, ears high, neck arched, tail flicking like he was young again. Jesse leaned forward and whispered something into his mane. And when they returned, Echo walked into the barn on his own, laid down in the straw, and didn't get up. The funeral was held on the 3rd day of silence. Luke dug the grave himself, no shovel touched by another hand. He buried Echo by the western cottonwoods, where Jesse Marlowe once carved his initials into bark and claimed the land as his own. They marked it with a stone, just one word, Echo. That night, they built a fire. Clara read Jesse's old letter aloud. Jesse Jr. cried for the first time since he was a baby. And Luke didn't say a word. He just stared into the flame, one hand resting on the pocket where the letter still lived, warm against his heart. Months passed. The ranch moved forward, as it always did, but something shifted. Echo had been more than a horse. He had been memory. He had been guardian. He had been the bridge between what was lost and what was built again. So when Jesse Jr. asked if he could build something new near Echo's grave, Luke didn't hesitate. It started as a bench, then a post, then a ring, and within the year the land by the cottonwoods became a schoolyard. For colts, for children, for dreams. They called it Echo's Reach. Every spring, Clara would gather the town's children and tell them the story. About a horse that refused to be broken. About a man who learned to listen. And about how sometimes the loudest truths come from the quietest creatures. 10 years later, Jesse Jr. took over the ranch. Luke and Clara moved into the smaller house behind the barn. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because the land had become more than survival. It had become legacy. And in the evenings, when the wind shifted just right, Luke swore he could still hear hooves on dry dirt, a steady gallop, a quiet breath, and a voice like his father's is saying, "You did right, son." She wasn't a widow clinging to what was lost. She was Clara, a woman who stood beside a man building something new. And he wasn't just Jesse's son. He was Luke, a man who chose not to avenge, but to understand. And Echo? Echo was never just a horse. He was a witness, a keeper of memories, a bridge between sorrow and second chances. This story didn't end in fire or gunpowder. It ended in breath, in forgiveness, in the quiet sound of hooves beside a cottonwood grave. Because sometimes the most powerful rides don't leave tracks. They leave legacy. If this story stirred something in your chest, if you've ever loved without needing to speak it, then you're one of us now. Welcome to Wild West Stories, where silence heals, where loyalty lasts, and where love rides slow but forever. Tap like if Echo's final gallop left a mark. Hit subscribe to follow the trail of stories that ride deeper, and drop a comment. If Echo were yours, what would you name him? Because some stories never fade, and neither will this one.